There is a man who wakes up every morning, puts on his best cardigan, carefully polishes his shoes, and walks into a cafe where nobody knows his name. Not because he is a stranger, but because the world stopped seeing him the day his wife died. Stay with me, trust me, you won't regret listening. Before we begin, if stories about real human kindness move you, hit that subscribe button and the bell icon. This one is going to stay with you. Some people walk into a room and command attention. They're loud, bright, impossible to ignore. And then there are people like Gilbert. Gilbert Rousseau walked into Café Lumière every single morning at 7:15. Same time. Same corner table by the window. Same carefully ironed shirt. Same worn but polished shoes. He never made a fuss. Never complained. Never asked for anything extra. He simply sat down, unfolded his newspaper, and ordered his tea. 2 sugars. No milk. And nobody noticed. Not really. Elise Caron was 27 years old and had been working at Café Lumière for 5 years. She had come for a summer job and never left, because life, as it often does, had other plans. Her mother had fallen ill. The bills had piled up, and the café became less of a job and more of a lifeline. She had learned to smile through exhaustion, learned to be warm even on cold days, learned to read people, not just their orders but the spaces between their words. And the moment she truly saw Gilbert, really saw him, was the morning he said something she almost missed. He was settling into his usual seat, hands trembling slightly as he reached for the menu he never actually read, when he whispered, almost to himself, "I just miss someone remembering the small things." Elise stopped. She turned around, walked back to his table, and poured his tea before he even asked. 2 sugars, no milk, she said softly. "And you always read the back page first, even though you start from the front." Gilbert looked up at her, and his eyes, faded and tired, filled with tears he was too proud to let fall. "You noticed," he whispered. "Everyone deserves to be noticed, Monsieur Rousseau." After that morning, something shifted. Elise learned his story, the way you learn about weather, slowly, gradually, one cloud at a time. His wife, Celeste, had passed away 3 years ago. His son had relocated to London for work. His grandson, Roman, visited perhaps twice a year, always distracted, always rushing, always one foot already out the door. "I don't blame them," Gilbert told her one quiet Tuesday, stirring his tea. "People have lives to live. I'm just between chapters now, waiting for the last page." Elise reached across the table and placed her hand gently over his. "Maybe the last chapter hasn't been written yet, Monsieur Rousseau. Maybe it's just getting started."
He smiled at that.
A slow, grateful smile, the kind that lives in the eyes long after it leaves the lips. She started doing small things, reserving his corner table during the morning rush, setting aside his newspaper before other customers could take it. And on the morning of his birthday, which he had mentioned only once, months earlier, she brought him a slice of tart tatin with a single candle pressed into the center. Gilbert stared at it for a long moment. Then he wept. Quietly, openly, without shame. "You're the only one," he whispered. "The only one who remembered." Elise sat with him until the candle burned down. She didn't say anything. Sometimes kindness doesn't need words. Sometimes it just needs to stay. And in that small cafe, on a cobblestone street in Lyon, something tender and unplanned had begun. Neither of them knew yet just how far it would reach. There is a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't knock loudly or make a scene. It creeps in quietly, through empty chairs at dinner tables, through phones that don't ring, through mornings that look exactly like the one before. Elise watched it happen to Gilbert slowly, the way winter strips a tree gradually, then all at once. The changes were small at first. His hand shook a little more each week. He began repeating stories he'd already told her, the same memory about Celeste's garden, the same joke about French bureaucracy, and Elise listened every time as though it were the first. Because that's what kindness does. It doesn't keep score. Then came the cane. Then a slower walk. Then mornings where his clothes hung looser on his frame, as though his body was quietly shrinking away from the world. Elise noticed all of it, and said nothing. Because Gilbert was a proud man, and pride, in the elderly, is one of the last things they have left. You don't take that from someone. You just stay close. Then one gray Monday morning, Gilbert didn't come. 7:15 passed. Then 8. Then 9. His corner table sat empty, newspaper folded and waiting, tea unpoured. Elise felt his absence the way you feel a missing step in the dark. That sudden drop. That jolt of wrong. She finished her shift in a fog. Then she looked up his address, scribbled in the old paper reservation book nobody used anymore, and walked to his house after work. It was a small stone house on a quiet street. Window boxes that had once held flowers, now empty. A welcome mat worn thin from years of use. She knocked. It took a long time for the door to open. Gilbert stood there in his pajamas, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. Embarrassed in the way only someone deeply independent can be embarrassed, by needing help. "I fell," he said simply. "Nothing broken. Just tired. So very tired, Elise." It was the first time he had ever used her first name. She started coming by after her shifts. Groceries. Prescriptions. Reading the newspaper aloud, when his eyes grew too weak for the small print. Sitting with him through the slow evenings when the silence in that house became too heavy for one person to carry. Her manager warned her about shortened hours. About priorities. About the real world. Elise nodded politely and kept going. Because what is the real world, if not this? An old man alone in a house too big for one person. A young woman who understood loneliness from the inside out, who had watched it hollow out her own mother during years of illness. She knew what it felt like to be in a room and be invisible. She refused to let Gilbert feel that way. One evening, as the last light left the sky and the room grew warm and dim, Gilbert turned to her from his armchair. "Why do you do this?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "You owe me nothing, child. Nothing at all." Elise folded the newspaper slowly, looked at him. "Because someone should," she said. "Because you matter. Because kindness isn't something we give only when it's easy or convenient." She paused. "It's something we give because we're human. And being human means we don't leave people behind." Gilbert was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded once, slowly, deeply. The way people nod when words have landed somewhere true inside them. What Elise didn't know was that the following morning, Gilbert made a phone call. Then he wrote a letter. And then he sealed it carefully and put it away. 3 weeks later, Elise's phone rang. It was the hospice nurse. Gilbert Rousseau had passed away peacefully in his sleep. He had listed Elise Caron as his emergency contact. She stood in the back kitchen of Café Lumière and cried for a long time, mourning a man who had become family without either of them ever planning it. Mourning quietly, the way you mourn people the world doesn't think you're supposed to miss that much. The funeral was small. Elise, the hospice nurse, 2 neighbors who barely knew his surname. And then, just as it ended, the door opened. A man in an expensive suit walked in, breathless, phone still in his hand. "I'm Roman Rousseau," he announced. "Gilbert's grandson. I came as fast as I could." Elise looked at him for a long moment. "This is everyone," she said quietly. "You're looking at everyone he had." Roman's face went pale. He deserved that truth. But the story, the real story, was only just beginning. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like a man in an expensive suit standing at his grandfather's graveside, realizing, too late, that success had cost him something he could never buy back. Roman Rousseau stood at the cemetery in Lyon and said nothing. And Elise let him sit in that silence. Because some lessons cannot be softened. She thought that was the end. A sad, quiet conclusion to a lonely life. Gilbert was gone. The cafe would move on. The corner table would be someone else's favorite spot by next week. That's how the world works. It keeps moving. But 2 weeks later, Roman walked back through the doors of Café Lumière. This time without the rushed energy. Without the phone in his hand. He was flanked by 2 lawyers in dark coats, and Elise's stomach dropped. She had heard stories. Families appearing after funerals. Estates picked clean. Lonely people's final wishes buried under paperwork and greed. Miss Caron, one of the lawyers said formally, we need to speak with you about Monsieur Rousseau's will. Elise set down her tray. I don't want anything, she said carefully. I wasn't there for anything. I just didn't want him to feel alone. Roman stepped forward, and she saw something in his face she hadn't expected. Not arrogance, not entitlement.
Shame.
Raw, quiet, devastating shame. He left you the house, Roman said. But that's not why we're here. He swallowed hard. He left me a letter. And he asked, specifically, that I read it with you present. They sat in Gilbert's corner booth. The same table. The same window. The morning light falling across it exactly, as it always had. The lawyer placed a yellowed envelope on the table. Roman's hands trembled as he opened it. And then he read, Roman, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I hope you're not too late to the service. I am not writing this to shame you. I know you love me. I know you meant to call. I know life moved fast, and I was just a quiet old man in Lyon who didn't complain. But I need you to know about Elise Caron. She is a waitress. She earns very little. She has no extra time, no extra money, no reason at all to have chosen me. And yet every single day, she gave me everything that truly mattered. She remembered how I took my tea. She remembered my birthday. She saved my newspaper. She sat with me in the evenings when the silence became too loud. She saw me, Roman, when I had become invisible to almost everyone, including you. I am leaving her this house because she gave me something worth far more than property. She gave me dignity. She gave me the feeling that my life still had meaning. I am asking you, not as your grandfather, but as a man who learned this lesson far too late, to slow down, to look up, to remember that the people who love you will not always be there when you finally find the time. Do not build a life so busy that you forget to live it. Be better than I taught you to be. Be more like Elise. Gilbert. The café was silent. Roman lowered the letter slowly. His face had crumpled completely. All the polish and composure of a successful man dissolved into something much more honest. A grandson who had loved his grandfather and shown it terribly. I kept thinking I had more time, he whispered. I kept telling myself, next visit, next Christmas, next year. His voice broke. There is no next year. Elise reached across the table. He knew you loved him, Roman. He just needed to feel it more often. Roman looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. How do you do it? He asked quietly. How do you see people the way you saw him? Elise thought about it for a moment. You just decide to, she said simply. You decide that people matter more than your schedule. And then you act like it. What happened next was not something either of them planned. But Gilbert, it turned out, had planned it for them. Among his belongings was a folder. Neat, careful, organized in the precise way of a man who had once been an architect. Inside was a hand-drawn proposal, sketched in Gilbert's shaking handwriting, for turning his house into a community space. A place where elderly people in Lyon could come for company.
For coffee.
For conversation. He had even written a name at the top of the page. Gilbert's Corner. He had drafted it months before he died. He had simply been waiting for the right people to carry it forward. And he had known, with the quiet certainty of a man who had been paying attention, exactly who those people would be. 1 year later, Elise stood at the entrance of Gilbert's Corner. The old stone house had been opened up, warmed up, filled with mismatched chairs and small tables, and the smell of fresh tea. The window boxes had flowers in them again. The room was full. Elderly men and women who had been eating alone, sitting alone, existing quietly at the edges of a busy world, gathered together, laughing, talking, being seen. Roman stood beside Elise. He had cut back his hours. He had started volunteering. He had become, slowly and imperfectly, the grandson Gilbert always believed he could be. Do you think he knows? Roman asked softly, looking around the room. Elise smiled. I think he always knew. He just needed someone to prove it was possible. An elderly woman approached them, holding a cup carefully in both hands. She looked at Elise with bright, curious eyes. Excuse me, dear. How do you take your tea? Elise's breath caught. 2 sugars, she said softly. No milk. The woman nodded warmly. I'll remember that. Everyone deserves to be remembered. And standing there, in the house of a man the world had nearly forgotten, Elise finally understood what Gilbert had been teaching her all along. We are not here to be remembered by history. We are not here to be remembered by wealth, or titles, or the size of our achievements. We are here to be remembered by each other. In the small moments, in the daily rituals, in the simple, radical act of looking at someone and saying without words, "You matter. You are not invisible. And I remember how you take your tea. Before we go, I want you to sit with something for just a moment." Gilbert Rousseau was not a famous man. He did not change the world through power or influence or wealth. He was simply an old man who woke up every morning, polished his shoes, and walked to a café, hoping that today, someone would remember he was still alive. And most days, nobody did. We live in a world that moves so fast. Notifications, deadlines, schedules, ambitions, all of it pulling us forward, always forward, never still. And somewhere in all that rushing, we walk past people. We scroll past people. We sit across from people at Christmas dinner and never really ask how they are. Not because we are cruel, but because we forgot that kindness is not a grand gesture. It is not a donation or a speech or a viral moment. Kindness is remembering. It is showing up. It is sitting with someone in a quiet room when the world outside has forgotten they exist. It is learning how someone takes their tea and never forgetting. Gilbert didn't need money. He didn't need fame. He needed one person to look at him and say, "I see you. You are not invisible. You matter." And one young woman, exhausted, underpaid, carrying her own quiet struggles, chose to be that person. Not once, not twice, every single day. That choice cost her nothing but time and attention, and it built something that outlived them both. So here is what I want to leave you with tonight. Think of your Gilbert, because you have one. Maybe it's a grandparent who calls too often because they have no one else to talk to. Maybe it's a neighbor you always wave at but never stop for. Maybe it's a colleague who eats lunch alone every single day while the rest of the office moves around them like water around a stone. They are not asking for much. They're just waiting for someone to notice. Be Elise.
Slow down.
Look up. Remember the small things. Because the small things, as Gilbert knew better than anyone, are never really small at all. They are everything. If this story touched something in you, please don't let it end here. Backhand index pointing down, leave a comment below and tell me, who is your Gilbert? Who in your life deserves more of your time and attention? I read every single comment, and I would love to hear your story. If this moved you, share it. Not for the numbers, but because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear this today. Someone needs to be reminded that they matter. And maybe, just maybe, your share reaches the person who needs to become someone's Elise. And if you're new here, welcome. This channel exists for exactly this. Stories about ordinary people doing quietly extraordinary things. Stories that remind us what we're really here for. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and come back, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. Now go call someone you love. Studio microphone.